Max Langenkamp last night published on Substack a reader's guide to my writing. I've written over 20 something years, a huge amount of stuff on a lot of different websites. It's a complete tangled mess. And he has explained which are the good bits, where to start, why you might want to read it. And if you want to read more of what I've written than you have so far, but it seems overwhelming, then this could be really useful. His Substack is maxlangenkamp.substack.com. The camp is spelled with a K, maxlangenkamp.substack.com, and the title is "The World is a Cloud," which is referring to the theme of nebulosity, which comes up over and over again in what I write. If you go to his Substack, it's the most recent post there, so you can find it. I'd also like to mention an upcoming series of events. Yetzalkandro, who's a longtime student in Evolving Ground, which is the Vajrayana community co-founded by my spouse Charlie, Yetzalkandro and I are co-leading a reading of books by Pema Chödrön in Evolving Ground. It's open to any paying member of Evolving Ground at any level. Pema Chödrön, I read her books in 1995 when I was just getting started with meditation and Buddhism. That is somehow 30 years ago. These are wonderful books because she writes in this way that is very down to earth and friendly and warm and straightforward. They're easy to read. They're suitable for beginners. And at the same time, it's a little bit deceptive because they're really dense and serious in the sense of going deep. I'm expecting to learn new things from rereading them 30 years later. And I'm expecting to learn from Yetzal Kandro, who is co-leading this with me. She has a way of being and teaching that is much more like Pema Chödrön's than mine. Um, I tend to go off on intellectual tangents, which I will be doing during this, and that has its value, but it's also really valuable to speak from experience and from the heart, which is not so much my style, although I'm trying to develop that. So the first session of that is February 15th at 8:30 Pacific. If you're an Evolving Ground member, you can attend. If you would like to attend and are not an Evolving Ground member, then you can become one. So in the preliminary chat, a number of you put in questions that I really appreciate your doing this because it helps me think through ahead of time what I might say about these topics. And this time, I'm afraid I didn't understand all the questions very well, and I might go off on rambles that are not really addressing the points that you cared about. The first question came from Nikolai, a friend of mine and of ours, longtime Evolving Ground apprentice. He said, I heard you say something along the lines that learning some math can be generally helpful. In my mind, mathematics was something niche with relatively little benefit for most other areas of life. I think that's a common sense that you get from math education, which I'm going to be dissing a lot. I'm curious how I could be underrating the value of math and the benefits it can bring to other areas of life. How would you guess that learning that would be helpful? I'm going to give three answers. The first answer is fairly pragmatic. The others are much broader about understanding ways of being in the world overall. At a very, well, relatively practical, I mean, there's really practical ways you can use math in everyday life for like managing your finances. I think that's obvious. Something that's a little, it's still practical, but a little more abstract is a lot of things people say you can check with a very small amount of math. And this is particularly true in political discussions. People say things and you think, well, that sounds reasonable. I might agree with that. And then if you do a very small amount of math, you can check and see that what they're saying couldn't possibly work. An example from a few years ago, somebody said, well, we could confiscate all of Bill Gates's money and give $1 million to every American. And he's so rich, he probably wouldn't even notice. And like this seems like if we could do that, well, yeah, that might very well be a good idea. $1 million is a lot of money, but Bill Gates has like billions or something, so this ought to work, right? So, well, there's I happen to know, and it's useful to know some numbers. There's about 350 million Americans, and to give each of them a million, we would need 350 million times $1 million. A million is 1,000,000. Every time you multiply a big number by 1,000, the illions go up by one. In America and Britain, it's different, but they're wrong. In America, if you multiply a million by 1,000, it becomes a billion. You multiply by another 1,000, it becomes a trillion. So we have 350 million people. We're going to multiply that by $1 million. We do the thousands twice. We get 350 billion, 350 trillion. Well, that's a lot of dollars. I think for a lot of people, all big numbers are just big numbers, like 350 trillion, whatever. People get billions and trillions confused all the time. Again, it's useful to know some numbers. US GDP that's like the value of everything that everybody does economically in a year. That's more or less 35 billion. That's with a B. 350 trillion is with a T. That's 10,000 times more. Is it plausible that Bill Gates has 10,000 times more dollars than everybody produces in a year? No. How much money does Bill Gates have? Well, that's a number that maybe most people don't know, but I happen to know that at the time this was being suggested, he had about 35 billion. So if we did distribute all of his wealth across all Americans, it'd be about $100 each. That might be nice. It might be a good idea. But $1 million for everybody is life changing. $100 for everybody might be nice, but there's not a lot of people whose lives are going to be radically changed by that. So this policy proposal's attractiveness can be checked with arithmetic. Another example that requires a little more math is I read a lot of biomedical journal articles because I'm trying to figure out things about my health or the health of family members. I want answers about, is this supposed treatment likely to work? So doctors can't answer that a lot of the time. I go to read the journal articles and I can read like two sentences of them and say, okay, this is either false or meaningless because these numbers can't be right. The statistical method that they're using, if it's giving these numbers, this is nonsense. So that saves me a lot of time. That's a bit more esoteric. I wouldn't necessarily suggest that everybody could or should or would do that, but it does show that math can actually be practically useful for understanding things. There's a deeper cut on this, which is that learning some math lets you appreciate formal rationality. That comes with the experience of in math class being over and over and over again absolutely wrong. Woven throughout all of these questions, this experience of being wrong is really valuable and important. And the way that we relate to being wrong, we can relate to being wrong in a number of not very functional ways or ways that are more functional. It is frustrating and humiliating, and I hated it in math class to do a series of problems on some homework assignment and get a lot of them or even all of them wrong over and over again. And this is why a lot of people hate math and just refuse to go further with it. And they think there must be some special ability that you have that would let you not be wrong. And there actually isn't. There's a lot of attitude changes or ways of becoming happy with being wrong. Part of that is the revelatory experience of being right and having absolute confidence that you have got the correct answer. This is wonderful, and it's beautiful when you start to appreciate formalism for its own value, that there are structures of ways of acting that can give you complete confidence. And when you can apply those in some parts of the world, you can have nearly complete confidence and understanding and control over those parts of the world. And this is great. It is beautiful. It just appreciating it aesthetically, I think, is really transformative. This is where rationalism begins. It's taking this too far, thinking you can always do this, getting high on this, and making it into effectively a religion. And that is dysfunctional. And at some point, you need to realize that that kind of certainty, understanding, and control are not actually available outside of mathematics, but it's available to an extent, and that is worth appreciating. It's also worth appreciating because this was the basis of the European Enlightenment and the creation of the modern world. The world we live in was based on the idea that we should have a rational government, we should have a rational economy, we should make rational art. High classicism is this applied to art. And this worked extraordinarily well for 200 years, from the late 1600s to late 1800s. And the world we live in was built on this, and it's still, to the extent that it works, a lot of it it's falling apart. We live in postmodernity. It is disintegrating, but to the extent that it works, it partly works because of modernism, which is based on rationalism, which is based on math. You don't need a lot of math. You don't need to learn a lot of math to get this, but you need to learn some math in a way that lets you appreciate this sense of the beauty of the formal structure. So Nikolai asked, if you had to put together a math curriculum for someone, for example, Nikolai, what would I suggest? I think a good answer to this has to be very individual, because it depends on why you want to learn math. And that's going to have implications about what math is worth learning and how to learn it, because people have different actually ways they can learn math. We do math differently. Some people are very visual. Some people are much more symbol oriented. I'm like that. I'm lousy. Well, apparently everybody believes they're lousy at the visualization. I talked about that last time, so maybe I'm not as bad as I think I am. Uh, if we could have an individual math tutor for everybody, would be great. We don't have that. Last month, Tobin Davis Jones and others recommended Mathematica, which is a book by David Bessis. I still haven't read it. I'm embarrassed to say that, but I have flipped through it, and I can confirm the recommendation that it doesn't teach you math. It teaches you what math is, what it's like to do it, and why that matters. So that could be for someone who doesn't actually care about math for its own sake, but wants to have some grasp on what I just said about why it's important. This could be a good starting point. Co-ponder, that's someone who I don't know, but's been in a number of these sessions. And hello, if you're here, I can't see everybody who is. Several people recommended Math Academy. That's a website that's at mathacademy.com. They claim to have a breakthrough method for teaching math that is individualized using AI, that gives you a personal AI tutor for math. I looked at the website and it seems relatively plausible. If this works, it could be great. They claim remarkable results. Some people on Twitter have tried it and said yes. So that's exciting, and it's worth taking a look at. I would say it teaches the standard American math curriculum, and I think a lot of the stuff that's in there is junk. And trigonometry, nobody needs to learn trigonometry. It shouldn't be in their curriculum. Uh, we should stamp all over it, and Math Academy is going to teach you trigonometry because it's aiming towards being able to get ahead in the American curriculum. So that's a caveat. Right. I'm talking a lot. Jared has hopefully interrupted by asking what should trig be replaced with? Basic probability and statistics. There's an increasing movement to do exactly that. I don't know what the status of that is. It's coming along, and I'm really glad that that's happening. Those are actually useful in our world. Trig is in the curriculum because 150 years ago, when a math curriculum was being set down, it was intended for military officers, and knowing trig was essential for if you were commanding a boat for navigating it, and it was essential if you were an artillery officer for aiming the big guns. And like most people nowadays are not going to be aiming big guns by writing trig functions on a piece of paper, which is the way you used to have to do it. We have computers for that now, and not a lot of people become artillery officers anyway. Fatima Ali asked, how does meaningness differ from meaning making? Can these two overlap, especially in the context of education? This is a question where I'm not sure. Often when someone asks a question, it's a good question, and there's a question behind the question. There's some motivation for why this matters to the person asking the question, and it's actually better to answer to the motivation than the surface question. I'd like to be able to do that. I should first say what I mean by meaningness. I've actually used it in three different ways, of which I'll mention two, and it's confusing. One is the quality of being, I wrote being meaningful or meaningless. It would have been better to say being meaningful and meaningless, because these are always inseparably entwined. Nothing is absolutely meaningful. There are no absolutely definite meanings, and nothing is entirely meaningless either, although some things come awfully close. This is the theme of nebulosity and pattern, which is woven all through everything that I write. In Buddhist terms, this is emptiness and form. I don't use those words because there's a whole lot of baggage. Meaningness is pointing to that indefiniteness and yet also specificity of meaning in the sense of meaning of life, not meaning of a word. There's an ambiguity in English between those two different meanings of the word meaning. I had to invent this word meaningness because philosophers didn't have a word for it, which is really weird. Uh, there's the common term meaning of life, which is misleading because it just suggests that there is the meaning of life. And in fact, we are in a sea of meanings constantly impinging on us, and we are interacting with them. We are shaping meanings and being shapen by meanings, and our lives are a fabric shot through with meaningness, because none of these are very perfectly specific, but everything is meaningful to us. Meaning making is a term that I'm familiar with from the work of Robert Kegan, who's one of my main influences. He is a clinical psychologist and education theorist. His education theory is in what's called the Neo-Piagetian lineage, which starts with Jean Piaget, a child psychologist the Neo-Piagetian lineage extended that to adults. Kegan was not first in that lineage, but he was the one that most influenced me and a lot of other people because he wrote some brilliant books which talk about meaning making. I found them quite frustrating in never really explaining what he meant by meaning making. However, in the developmental psychology literature, he takes what's called a constructivist point of view, which says that understanding, meaning, knowledge are constructed by the individual. And this points at something really important in general, but also particularly for education, which is that we don't passively receive information, or we're not good at that. There's a model of education that the teacher knows a bunch of things, which are sentences, and they say the sentences, and they go out of the teacher's head, they come into your head, you store them in your head, and then you can regurgitate them on the exam. That's the way a lot of education works and doesn't work. It's not actually a good way of teaching or learning. And a lot of education theorists have been saying this for many decades. Kegan wasn't the first. Neil Postman, apparently, who's an education theorist, is the one who coined the term meaning making. There's a possible misunderstanding here. So there's a wrong idea that meaning is objective, that it's given by some external metaphysical source. The cosmic plan has all the meanings in it, and we perceive or somehow receive through intuition these meanings. That isn't actually how things are. Meanings are not objective. They're not externally given. So the possible mistake is to think that meanings are merely subjective and that we can just make them up. We can choose meanings that are arbitrary. This was the basis for existentialist thinking in the early to mid 20th century. It was influential on education theory. It was influential on Kegan. He doesn't make that mistake, but he doesn't point away from it as clearly as I think he could have and as I would like to. We can't choose our own meanings, and when we attempt to, usually that ends in nihilism. You realize that meanings can't be subjective, but you also understand that they can't be objective, and then you say, well, they don't really exist. They're illusory. They're a non-thing, and that's terrible. So don't go there. The the right interpretation of constructivism in developmental theory is that it's an interactive process. In education, the teacher is interacting with the students, but the students are also interacting with the material by actively making sense of it and working with it, applying it, working through problems. This is what homework should be for. It's really difficult to design good homework problems that actually give you the impetus to construct understanding through your interaction with them. Fatima, if you're here, is this addressing your question? I worry that I've missed the point. Oh, how can we? I think a question was how do we combine meaningness and meaning making? This idea of constructing meaning is woven through my book, Meaningness. Oh, I should say the non-subjectivity of meaningness has to do with the fact that we can be wrong about meanings. We can misperceive meanings. We do literally perceive meanings. There's an extended example in the meta rationality book with somebody playing a video game in which they come to understand the meanings of routine necromantic events while walking through this undead sorcerer's castle. We actually see what a zombie jumping out of a coffin, what does that mean for me? It provides an affordance for interaction, an opportunity for action, And that's what meanings are. That's the nature of meaning, is that they are opportunities for interaction. I'll go on to Max H's question, which is relevant here. So he asked if I know how much I know about Christopher Lasch or The Last Psychiatrist. The straightforward answer is I haven't read either of them. I know Lasch only at the Wikipedia level. I've been meaning to read his work for literally decades. It is highly relevant to one of the dimensions of meaningness that I talk about in the book. The Last Psychiatrist I only know vaguely through social media mentions. Both of them write about narcissism and the social effects of narcissism. And this is very relevant to me personally, as well as to one of what I call dimension of meaningness in the book, which is the uh, dimension of personal value at a metaphysical level. So there's this idea that we all have, it's in the culture, it's part of our background way of being that comes from the culture that we're not aware structures everything we do. The idea that we could somehow be special, not in a mundane way of some kind of accomplishment, but in some metaphysical way, that the eternal ordering principle could designate me as having some special value or role, some cosmic destiny that sets me apart from everyone else. And uh, I think secretly we all have a kind of sense that this might be true and a hope that it's true. And yet we realize, most of us realize that it also, this isn't really a thing. Like if you believe in God, in the Christian God, he only designated one person ever in history as special in this sense, namely Jesus. The rest of us are not special in a metaphysical sense. So the opposite idea is that we should be ordinary, that trying to be extraordinary is really a strategy for trying to be special, and that any attempt to do something out of the norm that is just putting on airs and trying to get people to tell you that you're special, and therefore we should not try to be extraordinary. And that, therefore, is a terrible mistake. The desire to be confirmed as special is the essence of narcissism. In narcissism, we need that confirmation of something which can't actually be metaphysically confirmed, but the next best thing is for people to tell us that we're special. This is something that I've struggled with a lot. When I was a kid, I was unusually good in school, and a lot of people were saying that I was special for this reason. And that really caused me a lot of problems and distortion of myself. It's taken a lot of work. I'm 60 something. I still feel this a little sometimes. I still find myself craving confirmation from other people that I'm special. And I don't do it so much, but it's still there, and I need to be aware of it. And there's a resolution to this, which is to say, we can't be special, but trying to be ordinary is making us less than we could be on behalf of others. The resolution is what I call a stance of nobility, in which we try to develop whatever capabilities we have in order to be helpful to others, to be useful, to be kind. Spontaneously beneficent is the term I sometimes use. Noble sounds, it's a little difficult to distinguish from specialness, and there's the whole history of aristocracy, which can make it a turnoff. But I think this is something worth knowing about and aiming for. I think from the little I know, the point that Lasch and the last psychiatrists were making is that This dynamic of tension between ordinariness and specialness tends to result in those of us who adopt ordinariness as our main mode of being. We project the specialness onto someone else, and this enables tyranny. We say, oh, the great leader, he's special. I'm ordinary. I'll do what he says. I will worship him. And this obviously can be catastrophic, has often in history been catastrophic. Since I don't know very much at all about Lash or the Last Psychiatrist, I may be missing the point. Adam Trop, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, asked, he's just finished Hubert Dreyfus's book, Being in the World, at my suggestion. Wow, congratulations, that is a hard book. Finishing it is an accomplishment. Which parts of Heidegger's, so this is about the philosophy of Martin Heidegger in his best known work, which is his earliest major work, which is called Being and Time. Which parts of Heidegger's philosophy still resonate with you, meaning me, David, or inform my worldview? In particular, do you think authenticity is a valid framework? This is an excellent question. It ties in with the question about Christopher Lasch and The Last Psychiatrist, I think, because the notion of authenticity is very much woven up with these ideas about the true self, which is connected with this idea of specialness, that if we could just find our true self and be authentic to our true self, that is a route to specialness. And that doesn't work because we don't have true selves. We have selves. They're true. They're not non-existent the way some versions of Buddhism say, but they're not true in the sense of authenticity. Heidegger, this is an existentialist idea, again, which is one of subjective meaning. There's a whole lot of philosophy is awful. It just makes everybody miserable. Like this idea of authenticity has ruined many, many lives. So, yeah, I don't think authenticity is a valid framework. Heidegger had a particular version of it, which is being towards death, being aware of your own death and relating to it. I think that is important. He made it the foundation of his recommended way of being in that book. I don't think that works. And it's not influential for me, although I have to say, I've got a book, I've got a website called Buddhism for Vampires, which is all about relating to death. So maybe it's more influential than I'm willing to admit. Dreyfus also dumps on that, and he says that the important thing for him in Heidegger, which is also the important thing for me, is his analysis of the everyday mode of being, which is a counter to the errors in rationalism. Rationalism imagines that our everyday mode of being is or should be a rational one of thinking things through logically, and that not only is not the way that we generally do things, it also shouldn't be and can't be. So Heidegger's critique of rationalism is foundational for a lot of my understanding and for Dreyfus's critiques of cognitive science, which I think were right on target, and of AI as it was then. Certainly were right on target then. It's hard to know what to think about the current wave of AI in the light of Dreyfus. I haven't actually made a serious attempt to do that. Somebody should. Heidegger himself rejected his own early work. His later work is also very interesting and influential for me. It's much less well known, much less influential, but among other things, he was essentially the founder of environmentalism. He has an essay concerning technology, and that was tremendously influential for both good and ill in forming the environmental movement. Max writes, Narcissism was an extremely tricky concept for me. Thinking about yourself as a main character in a story is a good first approximation, but Part of what makes it fascinating is the part of the pathology that happens someplace deeper than the part of your mind which holds stances. Interesting. I think it does go very deep. I also think these stances go deep. The stances are not their ways of being. They're largely not conscious. They're not articulated theories. I contrast in the Meaningness book stances with systems, which are articulated, structured ideologies. Stances are low, way below that. Max says, this is a very interesting answer, though. Thank you. Had not seen the connection to nobility. Well, I'm glad it was interesting. I want to go on to Vinod Kare's question. It's actually quite long, and I'll read what he wrote, and I'll keep breaking in, and I'm going to reject his framing repeatedly. It may sound like I'm being disagreeable, and I want to be clear that Vinod and I are friends, and I'm pointing out what I think may be some misunderstandings, but these are excellent questions, and the things I think he may be misunderstanding are things that I have misunderstood and it's taken a long time to work my way out of them. So he writes, you've often talked about caring about concrete reality or the actual situation. I actually wrote caring for concrete reality and the actual situation, and that's a critical distinction. I got that from Charlie, my spouse, who co-leads Evolving Ground, the Vajrayana meditation community that I'm part of now. The next thing that I'm trying to write, I've been stuck on this for months. I'm making progress now. I'm going to try to get it out next week, is about purpose, power, and ethics in technical work. And the distinction between caring about, which is the distinction between caring about and caring for is critical there. So I actually write about caring for the concrete situation. Vinod says, my mind is a muddle of ideas about this issue. We have inherited the evil philosophical tradition going back to the ancient Greeks, which messes up our minds. So we're all muddled about this. He says, here's a sample of my circuitous thinking. Our sense perceptions are fallible, and we cannot rely on them to tell us what's actually going on. This is where philosophy starts. It's one of its starting points historically in the pre-Socratics. It's also where, for a lot of us, it's where philosophy starts personally. We realize that we can't be certain, and we go to philosophy to try to understand what that implies. However, this idea that our sense perceptions are fallible and we cannot rely on them is really weird and wrong. There are optical illusions. We do make mistakes in perception. It is possible to be wrong. Again, the experience of being wrong in perception is really interesting, and a lot of meditation practices may leverage the weirdness of that experience, but it doesn't happen very much. And when it does happen, we almost always immediately notice and recover, and it's not a practical problem. Like, how often have you done something and kept doing something and gone on with whatever you're doing on the basis of a sensory misperception? This is extremely rare. So there's this kind of paranoia that philosophy starts with that takes this rare, odd experience and turns it into the basis for the whole thing, practically. I mean, I understand why, because when I was a kid, this was a real problem for me. Eventually, I realized, well, it doesn't happen very often, so it's not a problem. But I read philosophy partly for this reason. But I think at the beginning, and if you stick with it, it really is like a mental health issue. It's paranoid in a clinical sense. Like Descartes had this idea that there could be an evil demon who is maliciously tricking me into seeing all sorts of things that aren't true. And like, where does this fantasy come from? This is nuts. Absolute certainty is impossible outside of math, but look, this is blue. You can see it's blue. I can see it's blue. There is no meaningful possibility that this is not true. If you're colorblind, you can't see that it's blue, but then you can ask somebody, you can check with a bunch of people. We have interpersonal agreement as a not perfect, but often highly reliable source of truth, right? It says, therefore, we must use reason to figure out the truth. And this is where rationalism begins. It's the distrust of reality, of perception, of interaction, and saying, I don't trust that the world is the way that it in fact is. Therefore, I must figure everything out from first principles using logic, which in fact you can't do. So rationalism has this underlying anxiety, this terrible, gripping, nagging fear. You can see this in people who self identify as rationalists. The level of anxiety there is not always, but often very high. Um, However, reason has limits and fails in significant ways, many of which you've written about. It says yes. Moreover, what we see as the situation depends on our context and purpose. There could be water in the cells of the eggplant or not, depending on whether you're a chemist or a thirsty person. This is an example at the beginning of my Better Rationality book. I think this may be a mischaracterization. It's not that we're seeing the situation differently. We see the same thing. We understand the same thing. We're not in disagreement here. There's a misunderstanding underlying this of the nature of language. The purpose of language is to get things done collaboratively. So somebody knows whether there's water in the refrigerator in the relevant sense, so you ask them, in order that what you want is not to know the truth of an abstract proposition. What you want is a drink of water. And so you're collaboratively finding an affordance, an opportunity, interacting with another person in order to get that. It goes on even more over. We're also participants in the situation, which means that we make our own truth in a manner of speaking. Yes, in some manner of speaking. This comes back to that theme of the construction of meaning that came up in my answer to Fatima's question, that we can't make truth. We're involved in creating understanding, but it's not quite making. We have some freedom and ability, but the world gets a say. We're interacting with the world, and either there's water to drink in the refrigerator or not. There's some borderline cases. Does lemonade count? But in the end, you look in the refrigerator and there either is water or there's not. So it goes on. How then does one avoid falling into a radical relativism where everyone has their own individual perceptions of what the concrete reality is? This doesn't seem like an actual problem. Nobody falls into that kind of radical relativism. It's a theoretical possibility that comes out of bad philosophy. And nobody actually does this. Some intellectuals say we must all do this because there's no objective truth. Therefore, everything is radically relative. And if you looked at their personal life, that's not what's going on. It's not what's going on in anybody's life. So there is a brute fact that we do not fall into radical relativism. Now, you can ask an intellectual question about how do we not fall into radical relativism? And the answer is we have good enough ways of participating in the world such that it's giving us constant feedback about what's so and what's not so. So you look in the refrigerator and there's water there or there isn't water there. And yes, there's borderline cases, yada, yada. But being radically relativist and saying, well, since there's all these borderline cases, therefore water doesn't exist, which in fact is the root of Madhyamaka, which is bad Buddhist philosophy. That doesn't make any sense. One can be radically relativist about abstractions. The more abstract things get, the less easy it is to relate them in a meaningful way to reality. And then you can argue about these big abstract nouns. And this is where the experience of being wrong and really taking that in is helpful because people will argue about politics forever, and nothing you can say will shift some people's point of view because they are, in some sense, radical relativists. They may insist that they're the opposite, that the objective truth of this matter about sex or race or something is thus and so, but they're just going to argue. And they can argue because they're actually radical relativists and they're not interested in facts. Right. A software engineer who only cares about his next promotion might be as invested in the concrete situation as the one who cares about writing efficient software systems. Yes, they're motivated differently, and so they are perceiving different purposes in that situation. I think both of them could see the same purposes. If you really care about the software being well written, you also probably care about your own promotion, and you can certainly see why other people would care about their promotions. If you mostly just care about your promotion, you still understand that efficiency is a thing and you have to talk about software quality because that's part of the stupid social thing there, that to get a promotion, you're supposed to talk about software efficiency or something. So they're not completely perceiving the situation differently. They're mostly motivated differently, and their attention will be directed differently by their motivations, and they're more likely to perceive different aspects. I'll fail to answer one more question. This was asked by Peter in the preliminary web chat. It's some interesting questions that I'm not sure how to answer. I'll read it and then give a non-answer. I'm curious how your writing on meta-rationality and meaningness have framed your opinions about programming languages and programming schools of thought. This is a question that's not out of place because that was my career. Peter says, as I've been reading through Eggplant and Meaningness, I've been struck by how much discourse around languages and programming styles is people talking past each other, not being able to understand or disagreeing on the source of meaning. I think this is very true. There are religious wars about programming languages, famously, and those are very often based on ignorance of why particular languages are the way they are and what they're good for and how they function. These religious wars do resemble the culture war in a lot of ways and political dysfunction. Years ago, I was struck in the common trap of the language hype cycle, for example, object-oriented versus functional programming. When seen as a corpus of techniques, they are both useful toolboxes to draw from. I use that toolbox metaphor a lot in the meta-rationality book, that rather than striving to have a single consistent rational system for everything, you can potentially draw on many rational systems, which are many different programming paradigms in this case. And in other domains, for example, politics, one can say, well, I do see the value and the motivation and the compellingness of the principles underlying each of the major political tribes. That was something I put a lot of work into leading up to the 2016 election, trying to understand the various forms of conservatism that led to the election of Trump the first time, and I wrote quite a lot about that. It was personally transformative for me to get a better understanding viscerally of, having come up in a basically left background for the most part, getting a visceral understanding of why social conservatism is compelling, and feeling some of the force of that. I still have not learned Haskell. I feel I ought to. It is a programming paradigm that manifests religiously. I don't quite get the underlying intuition there, and I feel like I should. I'll skip over some details here, which are interesting, but if you don't know about programming languages, they won't make sense. Peter says, I think there are several stable stances. The first and obvious is the battle-scarred veteran that's above the hype, working pragmatically with their curated toolbox. I think that's the approach I take. I try not to be battle-scarred. I don't program very much anymore, and I haven't in 20 some years, but I remain curious about it and open, and I there's so much to hate in software, yet I also maintain a sense of wonder and enjoyment in discovering something new. So that may contradict the battle scarred veteran aspect of a certain kind of cynicism that I think you can condemn a lot of software engineering nonsense while still enjoying it. Peter ends, I think the act of programming and the programs that are produced are exercises in creating meaning and reflections of how we understand meaning. What do you think? I would love to hear more about that from Peter. I think it's right. I think I feel that. I hadn't thought about it quite that way, but again, there's a sense that I mentioned earlier. We're talking about discovering the feeling of what it means to be rational, to be able to deploy rationality and seeing the beauty of structure and creating new structure. That is intensely meaningful for me, and I think can be a transformative experience. And in terms of Kegan's work, this is a prerequisite to his stage four, which is Piaget's stage four originally, and it can break you through in beyond stage four towards stage five when you understand how that has to relate to reality and how it's a limiting view if you don't do the work of relating it to reality. And the last few posts in the meta rationality series that I put on Substack are about that process of relating the formal structure of software to the concrete reality of human lives. And the one about ethics and power that I'm struggling with and hoping I'll get out next week centers that. Question again from Mike Travers, following up on earlier discussion. We have different sides who hate and fear each other. That seems insoluble without some kind of revolution in thinking. Yeah, I do hope to be pointing in some such direction. There's several posts in the meaningness and time part of the meaningness book, which are about society and culture and how the understanding of meaningness, which I'm trying to grasp myself and to convey, how that may point ways forward for political and social and cultural conflict. It's really difficult and often discouraging, and yet I remain hopeful. Hope is sometimes said to be a virtue. In Vajrayana, it's actually said to be a downfall. It depends on the kind of hope. If it's a hope that is a wistful longing without action, then that's not really functional. It could be dysfunctional. If it's hope that motivates you to understand better, to interact, to act on the basis of that, then that seems like a really good thing. We're an hour and 15 minutes in. I'll make a couple of announcements. Some of you here know about Evolving Ground, maybe not all of you do. It is a community for meditation of a unique action-oriented variety, co-led by my spouse Charlie. There is a new course, which is now in beta, which was developed by several of Charlie's longtime apprentices based on Charlie's work and my work and what's been developed over the past several years collaboratively in Evolving Ground. It's called Approaching Vividness, which is a riff in part on my website, vividness.live. It is taught by the apprentices and they designed it. It is unlike anything else. The format is unique. It's 7 sessions on different topics that make extensive use of unexpected video presentations that lead to experiential exercises in which you will learn new meditation methods and also, hopefully, find the experiences that underlie ways of being that Evolving Ground aims to teach. One of the sessions is about nobility and how you develop nobility. So this ties in with what I was saying about nobility earlier. This is in beta test. It's available to some but not all Evolving Ground members, I think. The first session is next weekend. And if you're an Evolving Ground member, you get a monthly email announcing all of the events, and it'll explain how to join on to this if you're eligible. Oh, I said I'd say a little about teaching. My parents were both school teachers, and I vowed never to do that. And last weekend, for the first time, I was sitting on a stage in front of a relatively large audience. Some of you were there, teaching in a formal role, which is particularly weird because I was teaching Vajrayana Buddhism, where to teach that, you're supposed to be enlightened, which is a really big deal. You have to be special. To teach Vajrayana, you need to be special. That's the story. So the last time I taught in a formal role was in 1985, so exactly 40 years ago. I was a TA in the introductory undergraduate computer science course 6001 that some of you may have heard about. It was based on the book Structure and Interpretation of Computer Programs, which is a famous text. So this was my first time teaching in 40 years, and I really enjoyed it. I think I did an okay job, probably. I haven't yet watched the video. There's a video that I'll be watching, and I'll probably be terribly embarrassed, but I couldn't enjoy doing this as much as I do without your participation. So thank you for being here. There's 38 of you. I just feel startled and grateful that so many people show up for these. So thank you, and until next time.